Well, hello. Thank you to everyone who decided to tune in for today's breakout session. And I would like to say a special thank you to the Chamber of Commerce Foundation for including FirstNet in its Building Resilience Through Public-Private Partnerships conference. FirstNet is a successful public-private partnership that together with the FirstNet Authority and AT&T is addressing the communication challenges that have long plagued public safety communications and have hampered emergency response. As a result, first responders finally have a dedicated, purpose-built communications platform to meet their unique needs and priorities. And in the roughly 3 years since this partnership was launched, we have seen strong adoption from public safety. The nationwide build out is ahead of schedule, and first responders are increasingly relying upon FirstNet both for their day-to-day operations as well as during emergencies, ranging from tornado response, wildland fire, flooding, earthquakes, active shooter situations, and now the nationwide COVID-19 pandemic. As a member of the FirstNet team, I serve as our Director of Strategy and Policy. And in that role, some of my primary areas of focus include our build out of FirstNet in rural and tribal areas, as well as a member of our response operations group. So working alongside our federal as well as our tribal first responders when they are responding to emergency events. So again, really look forward to today's discussion, and we can dive in. So I think it's always very important to start a discussion about FirstNet to really level set how we got here. And the impetus behind FirstNet stemmed from the communication failures that occurred during the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And during 9/11, the responding first responder agencies who were first to the scene, many of them were using disparate radio systems that were inoperable and couldn't commonly communicate. The other issue was the reliance on commercial wireless networks that were being flooded by commercial users and commercial traffic, so that it was difficult for public safety and other first responders to be able to communicate amongst themselves. This had really devastating consequences and hampered the response. And so when the 9/11 Commission was evaluating how we as a country could improve our resiliency, could improve our preparedness, and prevent future attacks of that magnitude, one of the areas of that 9/11 Commission report was the need to create a dedicated network for America's first responders so that they would have a common platform by which they could communicate, share critical situational awareness information, and be able to coordinate their critical efforts. And so from that report and that recommendation, public safety across disciplines, being law enforcement, fire, EMS, emergency management, 911, they worked together to push for Congress to take action. And finally, in 2012, Congress did pass legislation that created the FirstNet Authority as an independent authority within the US Department of Commerce. Congress also set aside 20 megahertz of band 14 spectrum, specifically to support first responders. And it set aside $7 billion that the FirstNet Authority could use to actually build out this nationwide network. Congress was also quite specific in setting the expectation that the FirstNet Authority needed to think of a sustainable way that they could operate and evolve this network long term. The $7 billion, it's also important to note, did not come from taxpayer dollars. It was actually from a spectrum auction that the FCC had led. But there was the clear expectation that no further resources should be expected, and that the onus and responsibility was on the FirstNet Authority to think of a cost-sustainable way to be able to operate and successfully provide this service for America's first responders. So when the FirstNet Authority first started out, one of the very first things it did was doing extensive engagement with public safety to truly understand what their key requirements were, what their priorities were, what they needed from their network. And those requirements were baked into an RFP, a request for proposal, that sought a private partner that would work with the FirstNet Authority to build, operate, and maintain FirstNet for the 25-year life of the contract. And then AT&T, through that competitive process, there were several entities that did submit bids. AT&T was the only nationwide carrier to step up and submit a bid to be public safety's partner. And in March of 2017, the FirstNet Authority announced that AT&T would serve as its private partner in this public-private partnership to really make both Congress and public safety's vision for a nationwide dedicated communications platform a reality. So when looking at this partnership, it really is unique, and for those tuning in to this public-private partnership conference, I think there's a lot of really great lessons and best practices to learn from FirstNet. But just stepping back and looking at the two partners, starting out with the FirstNet Authority, there's really unique characteristics, expertise, and value that both partners bring to the table. Within the FirstNet Authority, one of the primary areas is a real depth of knowledge and expertise about first responders and public safety. Many of those who are working for the FirstNet Authority come from the public safety background. They work very closely with public safety associations and stakeholders so that public safety, both now and into the future, will always have a seat at that table. Built into the enacting legislation, and then also how FirstNet Authority runs and operates, is through public safety having a direct seat at the table through the FirstNet Board of Directors, which consists of public safety stakeholders, as well as a PSAC, a Public Safety Advisory Committee, that's made up of representatives across the public safety disciplines and representatives from state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. So again, to make sure that FirstNet is living up to its mission to be the partner and be public safety's network. The FirstNet Authority also plays a critical program management, contract oversight, and accountability role to ensure that the contract commitments are being fulfilled. And again, that public safety's network is being properly run, and that we're fulfilling that mission and meeting those unique needs. The other piece of it is the 20 megahertz of spectrum that was set aside by Congress, as well as the $6.5 billion in success-based payments to support the initial building of the FirstNet network. And I think it's important to note the success-based. And so per our contract and our task orders, before any of those payments are issued back to AT&T, the FirstNet Authority and AT&T, we work to show that those contract commitments have been met before any of those payments are then issued. On the AT&T side of the house, there are also kind of key attributes and features that we bring to the table. As the private partner working with the federal government, AT&T has a depth of security as well as technology and telecommunications expertise and background that we're able to contribute and really offer up for FirstNet. Additionally, AT&T is committed to spending $40 billion over the life of the FirstNet contract. And that comes through, in part, some of these, we will be making reinvestment payments back to the FirstNet Authority, that the FirstNet Authority will then work with public safety to figure out how do those reinvestment payments get invested back into the network to continually drive evolution and advancement for public safety. AT&T, as the private partner, also said, not only are we going to be building out the 20 megahertz of the band 14 spectrum, but we are also going to open up our entire LTE commercial network. And so all of our commercial LTE spectrum bands will be brought to bear to support first responders on FirstNet. And so with that being said, FirstNet users have access to prioritized treatment across band 14 as well as the commercial AT&T spectrum bands. So that's just kind of a high level view of the partnership. So when looking at our contract with the FirstNet Authority, we really can look at it in kind of three principal areas. The first is making sure that we are delivering a quality, a superior product and service, unlike anything that exists in a commercial wireless environment. And that's through driving adoption. So as part of our contractual commitments, we have user adoption targets that we have to meet. And it's important to note that no public safety agency is required to use FirstNet, that the onus is on AT&T as that private partner working with the FirstNet Authority to make sure that this is cost competitive and a quality service that first responders themselves are choosing to adopt. The other piece is driving innovation. So it's not just building out the network, but it's also making sure that we are working with other partners and other technology leaders, device manufacturers, application developers to really drive innovation and new solutions for first responders. And so also part of our contract is meeting certain innovative deliverables. So things like turning up the dedicated, physically separate network core that has additional security features and ensures that public safety's FirstNet traffic never commingles with commercial traffic. Other things like rolling out a dedicated FirstNet application ecosystem, working with app developers to come up with new application solutions, also working with device manufacturers to ensure that the band 14 is being built into those devices. So regardless of if you are an iOS or Android, or if you want a purpose-built, more ruggedized device, there are many device solutions available to those FirstNet users. The other important piece is the build out of this network. And so we do face, also per that enacting legislation, there are rural coverage commitments that then were translated into that RFP and finally the contract. So we do face strict build out requirements, both in rural and non-rural areas. And that is another key area of our contractual commitments with the FirstNet Authority. So when looking at who is a FirstNet user, it's very important that recognizing this is public safety's network, that we need to ensure that it truly is those who are supporting emergency response. Those are the ones who are benefiting from this. And so there's two categories of users. The first is primary users, and those are the folks who have the highest level of priority as well as ruthless preemption on the network. So they have that dedicated connectivity as needed. So generally they reside in band 14, so that designated public safety band. But in the event of an emergency, if the network becomes congested, they can actually start to have priority, and they always have always on priority, but they can actually start to ruthlessly preempt other users across the spectrum bands. And so that just ensures that during times of emergency, as well as their day-to-day operations, that they have that connectivity when and where they need it. And the types of users include fire, police, EMS, the public safety answering points, emergency management, as well as healthcare emergency department personnel. Then there's an extended primary community. So those are the folks who support first responders during emergency events. And so some examples would be other healthcare workers, utility workers in the event of a windstorm or a hurricane, where they might be called upon to actually clear down power lines to make sure it's safe for those first responders to start the response and recovery efforts. Transportation is another example of an extended primary user. So folks who might be called upon to support an evacuation or other type of emergency efforts. And then now, looking at, so we're about roughly three years into this partnership, and we have seen really tremendous response from the public safety community. We currently have 1.3 million connections on FirstNet, and that represents more than 12,000 agencies across the country. And some examples of those agencies are folks like FEMA, the US Coast Guard, Seattle Fire Department, the Pennington County Sheriff's Department in South Dakota, the Oglala Sioux Tribes, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, the Anchorage Police Department. So as you can see, there really is a range of rural, tribal, suburban, urban agencies. Also, it extends across jurisdictions, being federal, state, local, tribal, county. And FirstNet is a game changer. Never before have first responders, regardless of jurisdiction, regardless of discipline type, had one common network that they could rely upon to reliably communicate and really ensure that they can work together through mutual aid and effectively be able to support their mission at hand. We are also currently progressing in a 5-year build out of FirstNet. And to date, as of May of this year, we have the Band 14 public safety spectrum deployed in more than 700 markets across the country. And per our contract, we are more than 80% along in that Band 14 deployment across the country, so ahead of schedule. And one of the really valuable, just exciting parts of FirstNet is the rural coverage piece. And within the enacting legislation, it was made a priority to have rural coverage objectives. And that was something that was carried into and incorporated into that RFP, and then ultimately the contract with between AT&T and the FirstNet Authority. And we are currently in the process of a 5-year build out through 2023. And at every single year of that build out, we face strict rural coverage targets that need to be met. We are in the process of deploying Band 14 spectrum to tens of thousands of sites across the country. And then we also are deploying more than 1,000 new cell sites in areas that governors as well as public safety stakeholders identified as coverage priorities. And so one really unique element that is the benefit of this unique public-private partnership is that whereas in a commercial network, rural areas often had to kind of wait till the back of the pack. Many of the investment decisions were being led by ROI and where was their population and density. But with FirstNet, it really changes that calculus, and the focus is on where does public safety need that connectivity. And so that's really the driving force behind the build out of FirstNet. One of the other secondary benefits that communities have as we're building out FirstNet is that while, yes, public safety always has that priority and preemption on the network, when there is excess spectrum available, commercial users on AT&T Mobility will also see both the coverage and the capacity benefits as this mobile broadband is built out to these areas. This slide here shows some of the recent ribbon cuttings and celebrations that we've had as this new FirstNet infrastructure comes to communities. And again, we're in the midst of a 5-year build out. And of those 1,000 new cell sites that we are working to deploy. More than 250 of them are now on air, serving first responders and the broader community in these, largely rural areas that have long, lacked the connectivity. And I'd like to draw attention to the picture in the lower left-hand side. And that was the groundbreaking ceremony that we had with the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And according to the tribe, before this FirstNet tower site, only approximately 20% of their reservation had connectivity. With this FirstNet new tower site, now that it's on air and it went on air earlier this year, roughly 80%. So that's quite dramatic for those first responders responding to emergencies, as well as that broader community. So that's just one of the really exciting success stories, but there is a compelling story really behind every one of these sites. And as we see the reach of the FirstNet network being built out, and it really is thanks to this unique public-private partnership that's allowing for new infrastructure to go to areas that, if it weren't for the PPP, these communities may have had to wait 5, 10, 15 years, or there might just not have been that commercial justification. But thanks to FirstNet and changing the calculus, they're seeing this critical infrastructure come to their communities. One of the other big game changers with FirstNet is so that FirstNet users have access to a dedicated fleet of network deployable assets. And so these assets can be available upon request and free of charge for FirstNet subscribed agencies. And they can come to support FirstNet agencies during planned events such as parades, sporting events, rodeos, you name it, state fairs, as well as during emergencies, ranging from fires, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, gas explosions, other emergency type events. And specifically, these assets really play a critical role where infrastructure has been damaged, like we saw out west with the wildland fires, or in areas where public safety is staging a search and rescue in a very remote area that lacks connectivity. Because of this, these dedicated assets, public safety now has the confidence that they will have the connectivity they need to support their mission when and where they need it. So thanks to this public-private partnership, there are 72 dedicated, what we call cell-on-light trucks. So those can operate with, independent of commercial power. They can utilize satellite backhaul, and they essentially function as a mobile cell site. We also have available to our FirstNet users 3 flying cows, and those are cells on wings. So those are an aerial cell site that can fly at about 200, 300 feet and provide coverage to support emergency response. And then finally, we recently rolled out an aerostat. So that's essentially a blimp, and we call it FirstNet-1. And that asset can fly at 1,000 feet and be able to cover a much larger area and ensure that connectivity is there for first responders. And how we have worked to organize what we call our response operations group and the management of these assets is through aligning ourselves with the National Response Framework, also using the language and organization of NIMS, the National Incident Management System. And we have worked to be in close alignment with state emergency operations centers, as well as federal, local, tribal emergency management operations, so that we can truly align ourselves with those first responders and make sure that we are serving as that trusted partner that as they're staging their operations, as they are going into areas where they may face connectivity constraints, that we are there with them to support that mission. Some examples of times that we have gone in. One of the best examples is in 2018. We saw a very active hurricane season with Hurricane Florence, as well as Hurricane Michael In the case of Hurricane Florence, we received about 20 requests from FirstNet agencies. We had pre-staged assets so we could get them, quickly on the scene, as soon as it was safe to get those units into the field. In many cases, we worked alongside first responders, where they were the ones who even helped provide us access. They helped, lead us into an area. At one point, the FirstNet service was providing so critical because there really was no other connectivity solution, available, that we actually had a first responder agency fly in a Black Hawk helicopter to actually deliver FirstNet devices to those responding first responders. In the case of Whiteville, North Carolina, they actually had their land mobile radio system was disrupted due to the hurricane, but thanks to FirstNet and their ability to request these deployable assets, they were able to operate and manage their response using the FirstNet assets. The other example would be Hurricane Michael. So that was also quite a devastating hurricane. This was one of the very first times that we actually had deployed one of our FirstNet flying cell on wings to Mexico Beach, Florida, to provide that critically needed connectivity. We could go into many different examples with wildfires, floods, earthquakes, but again, those kind of help to paint this picture. But even beyond having the voice communications, the other key piece is being able to have the connectivity and the confidence that first responders will have the ability to use mobile applications. So before FirstNet, many public safety agencies viewed mobile apps as, well, yeah, it would be great to have, but if I can't trust that it will work when I need it, I can't rely upon it. But with FirstNet, it really changes that, because there is the prioritized priority preemption, as well as the ability to request these deployable assets, so that first responders truly have confidence that they will have the connectivity they need when and where they need it. And this screenshot here is from an incident commander in the Pacific Northwest, who was able to show, thanks to the connectivity that he was able to have with one of these deployable assets, that he's able to track. So the red is where the actual fire is. And then the different colored dots, those are where his various fire teams, where his other assets that he had deployed in the field were located. So he's able to have greater visualization to better stage, ensure the safety of his personnel, and really just enhance situational awareness that is thanks to this public-private partnership. In addition to emergency events, FirstNet deployable assets have also served in some major planned events, such as the Super Bowl, the Boston Marathon. Here's the asset that we had at the starting line. But then also even smaller community events, but large and significant for those communities hosting them. So here are some of our tribal events that we have supported with FirstNet. But now coming into COVID-19, and so that has been one of the great tests for FirstNet. It also has really reinforced the importance of having a dedicated network for America's first responders and healthcare workers. So ever since, we received our very first call from a first responder agency for the very first quarantine site that was being stood up in the United States, and that was in late January. And ever since then, as communities across the country have worked to stage their field hospitals or testing sites, quarantine locations, that we have been there with them to ensure that they had the connectivity that they needed to make sure that they were able to serve their communities, support contact tracing efforts, support remote patient monitoring. And so Since the COVID-19 pandemic really came to the United States, we have seen more than 450 agencies across the country expand their use of FirstNet to support their COVID response. We also have been in close alignment with FEMA as well as other local, state, tribal, county emergency management personnel. So as they're evaluating staging new field hospitals, we've been providing assessments. So we perform more than 4,750 assessments at locations so that they would have that awareness of what the network looked like. And if there were any concerns about connectivity constraints, that we were able to work with them to get them the dedicated deployable assets that they needed. Some of the initial reports that have come out when you look at first responder usage, it's generally 2 times that of a regular commercial user. So that really enforces the need that these personnel have for that priority and preemptive treatment on the network. So across the country, since the COVID-19 crisis began, we have received more than 50 COVID-19 related requests from FirstNet users. But then it's also important to recognize that emergencies don't stop when we're having a global pandemic. So we've also had to respond to other type of emergencies, such as the very active tornado season that we saw in the southeastern United States this spring. So here are just a few examples of what this response in partnership with public safety has looked like during the COVID-19 emergency. So one of the areas of response was making sure that the UNS Mercy as well as Comfort in New York, that they had the connectivity that they needed to support those patients who were coming to these temporary field hospitals. And so on the left-hand side, you see the portable assets that we were able to deploy to support the UNS Mercy. On the right-hand side, we also, using FirstNet, were able to support the hundreds of hospitals that were staging and working throughout the region in New York City. And many of these hospitals are responding to mutual aid. So they are operating on different radio networks. But fortunately with FirstNet, they were able to have one common source of communication. They also were using some of the location tracking so they could see a visual of where across the city these dispatching ambulances were located. Also, they were using Sonum devices, and these are ruggedized, purpose-built devices that can truly be decontaminated. They can be submerged in bleach. And that was another kind of benefit and way that we saw the first responders and the EMS and ambulance personnel utilizing FirstNet as this common interoperable platform for communication to really support their COVID-19 emergency operations. These are just a small sampling of some of the testing sites that we were able to stage. So many of these locations were turned up in parks or other parking lots. And there are areas that maybe weren't equipped to have the connectivity or to really, have the capacity to be flooded with all of the both first responder as well as consumer traffic. So we were able to bring in additional assets to ensure that first responders had that needed connectivity at these testing locations. Another big area of importance is ensuring that we're working closely with EOCs. So that extends from the FEMA National Response Coordinating Center to state EOCs as well as local and tribal EOCs. And so here are just a couple examples of the FirstNet dedicated assets that we had in Oregon, as well as the Confederated Tribes of Colville Reservation. They had a tribal EOC and testing site where they needed additional capacity, and we were able to get them a FirstNet asset to meet that FirstNet connectivity need. Finally, here's an example of some of our responses to the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation has had one of the largest and most devastating COVID-19 cases in the country. And so when both tribal as well as the FEMA first responders were staging their operations to serve the nation. We were able to work with them in some of their more remote locations to ensure that they had these mobile assets and that their communications needs would be met throughout this pandemic. But again, like I said at the start of our discussion about the COVID-19 response, that regular disasters and natural emergencies don't cease during a global pandemic. And so just like first responders need to be nimble and ready to respond to these emergency events, alongside responding to a pandemic, as has the FirstNet Authority and the AT&T FirstNet program. And so these are just some images of some of our FirstNet response this spring after devastating tornadoes impacted Tennessee and other parts of the Southeast. And we were able to ensure that they had the connectivity that they needed. In the case of Cookeville, their primary serving land mobile radio tower also was affected. And so, for a brief period, they were without, communications, but thanks to FirstNet and per our contract, we have actual response time obligations, a 14-hour response. And we generally get, far under that. But we were able to get into the area, working alongside public safety to ensure that those first responders had the critical connectivity to support the response and recovery efforts. And so now moving forward, looking ahead, it's important to see that with this public-private partnership, it has been tremendously successful. We have been able to effectively meet the needs of public safety. We've been able to be nimble, that whether it's a natural disaster or a nationwide pandemic that 6 months ago, none of us would have believed or expected, that FirstNet has been able to scale to be that partner to healthcare workers, to other first responders. But looking ahead, we, as part of this public-private partnership, there are these reinvestment payments, and even beyond the initial 5 years, there will be continued reinvestment and advancement to continue to ensure that the network is constantly evolving and constantly evolving alongside public safety to meet their needs. And so just last month, in June of June 17th, the FirstNet Authority Board actually did make their very first reinvestment decisions to make investments for 5G, as well as expanding that dedicated fleet of network deployable assets. And so across the 25 years, we will continuously see the FirstNet Authority working along public safety to understand what their needs are, and that feedback from public safety will be informing kind of the future evolution of this network. So with that, I'd be open to questions, but I do think that this was a great opportunity to be part of this conference. The FirstNet public-private partnership really is an effective model for public-private partnerships, kind of the great value that can come when the government and private sector work together to address unique needs. And in the case of FirstNet, it was addressing really a void that had existed. Public safety's communication needs were not being met by commercial wireless networks. And thanks to this public-private partnership, we are able to meet the unique connectivity needs and really provide this single nationwide purpose-built network and communications platform for first responders. So with that, I look forward to answering your questions, and thank you all for tuning in.
Yes, Carrie, so there was one question that came in. Is FirstNet in place throughout the whole United States, and do all states use FirstNet?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And after First receiving the contract award, the FirstNet Authority and AT&T actually worked together to create custom state plans for all 50 states, DC, and the 5 territories. And then we worked with the states, territories, and DC to further refine that plan, work with them to understand where they wanted additional coverage, where they had other unique priorities, and that was built into the plan. And every single one of those 56 states, DC, and territories then had the choice of whether they were going to opt into the network or they could have opted out and built their own radio access network. Fortunately, we ended up seeing all 56 states, DC, and territories opting in. And at this point, we have FirstNet users in every single one of the states, and we are actively progressing in our build out of the public safety band 14 across the 50 states, DC, and the 5 territories. So the answer is yes, it is available across the country. It currently reaches 99% of the US population. But one of the things we always do when starting out, if an entity is interested in signing up, is talking to them about what their coverage looks like in areas that might be more rural and remote. It's making sure that they have visual into kind of what that plan is so they know, because we want to ensure that the coverage is there to support them. But yes, but the answer is that it is available across the country, and we're really thrilled to see, in every single state that first responders are making that migration and are signing up and joining their dedicated network.
Great, thank you. And then there is one more question asking about lessons learned that you referenced briefly at the beginning of your presentation. Is there a document that exists that sort of captures these lessons, or would you mind sharing some of the lessons learned at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think with FirstNet, one of the great lessons learned is being able to maximize the expertise and value that both of the partners bring to the table. So in the case of FirstNet, you have the FirstNet Authority with that deep public safety expertise. They understand through their extensive consultation with public safety, what first responders wanted from their network. They also play a really critical role for accountability and oversight, so that public safety is confident that the network is truly being built out to their requirements, and they have that faith and confidence that their network is living up to that mission and their vision. On the AT&T side, finding a partner that has that technical expertise, we were also able to be creative and bring to bear existing infrastructure in addition to then the new infrastructure. So we were able to be more targeted and really looking at, where do we want to extend the infrastructure, because we were able to start with a very effective baseline and leveraging some of that existing infrastructure. We have had some really exciting conversations with state, local, tribal entities that have recognized the value of FirstNet. They themselves in many cases operate their own land mobile radio systems, and they're starting to think about how can they incorporate FirstNet and really build upon their existing statewide or regional communication platforms and make sure that they're fully leveraging FirstNet. And so some of the exciting conversations we've had at those more local levels is that local entities have come forward offering up tower infrastructure or really being good partners in helping us effectively get this infrastructure deployed. So I would say that I think it's building that trust. It's coming together and recognizing kind of the unique attributes and expertise and value that the different parties can bring. But then I think also having the accountability and scrutiny and oversight is another, really critical ingredient.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions at this time.